So it's with a lot of pleasure. Been looking forward to our poet tonight, John Brehm, and it's my pleasure to introduce him. John was born in Lincoln, Nebraska, and educated at the University of Nebraska and Cornell. He's the author of Sea of Faith, which won the 2004 Birmingham Prize, and Help is on the Way, which won the 2012 Four Lakes Prize, both from the University of Wisconsin Press. He's published a chapbook, The Way Water Moves, from Flume Press, and was associate editor of the Oxford Book of American Poetry, 2006. His poems have appeared widely in Poetry, the Gettysburg Review, the Southern Review, Boulevard, Gulf Coast, the Missouri Review, New Ohio Review, Best American Poetry 1999, and I can say The Sun, too. We happened to recently subscribe to The Sun. People are familiar with The Sun. And it was getting ready for the season, and I opened it, the magazine. It's the first one we got, and it was in August. There was a poem of John's on page 22 where it was meant to be. And I thought, yeah, that is great. He's taught at Cornell, Emerson College, and Portland State University, and received fellowships from the Oregon Literary Arts and Yaddo. From 1996 to 2008, he lived in Brooklyn, working as a freelance writer and as a senior copywriter at Oxford University Press. He currently lives in Portland. He teaches for the Literary Arts and Mountain Writers Workshop. He also teaches reading as a writer courses at Lighthouse Writers Workshop in Denver, Colorado. You can view his website, and I think you may know it's www.johnbrehm.net. So we are delighted to have him here reading tonight. Would you join me in welcoming our poet tonight, John Brehm? John? Yeah.
Thanks very much, and thanks so much for coming out. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be part of this distinguished series and to see such a good crowd. I'm teaching now, and I required, of course, my students to attend, and I'm just trying to see. I'm not sure everyone is here, but thanks to Tom and to Pond House for bringing me here. It's wonderful to be here, and it's great to read for so many wonderful poets in the audience. It's a little intimidating, but it's great. So I'm gonna read some poems from. Oh, and can you hear me? Okay? No? A little more? All right. How's that? Much better. That's better? Okay. So I'm going to read some poems from my first book, Sea of Faith, and then some poems from my latest book, Help Is on the Way, and then some new poems if there's time. And as some of you know, I lived in Oregon before. I lived here from 1990 to 1995. I just moved back about 3 years ago. And when I left Portland before and moved back to the East Coast, I decided to drive the 3,000 miles in a rather unreliable car, and that turned out to be not the smartest decision I've ever made. And this is a poem about that experience. It's called When My Car Broke Down. I was somewhere in Utah or Wyoming, somewhere in the high inhuman deserts, in the thin blue flame of wavering air, bluffs of red earth scorched and stratified on the horizon. I had stopped to admire the desolation, to smoke a cigarette and consider that 10,000 years ago this was all underwater, that strange fish would have swum through the space my eyes now occupied. Before that, ice, and before that, something else again, unimaginably alien. The Buddhists say, first thought, best thought. But my first thought when I saw the steam billowing up from under my car was, if I just keep driving, maybe it will go away. After all, I was moving 3,000 miles, not to escape my problems, but to put a nice distance between them and me. A problem has to be fierce to travel that far. My second thought was to stare at the engine for a while. I leaned over and looked down into it as into the bowels of a ship or the cranium of some fantastic beast, and recalled how my father tried to teach me about cars. Mostly he had me hold the light for hours and mostly I studied the back of his head, turning over the words he said and knowing even then I'd never understand. The blood would drain from my arm, and I'd prop it up with my one free hand to keep from caving in or betraying my half-heartedness. Even then, I was hopelessly afflicted with the disease of the wandering mind. Even then, I was dreaming myself across magical landscapes just like this, and learning all he had to teach me about standing rooted to one spot, wishing I were somewhere else. If only I had paid attention. So after I left here, I was at Cornell briefly as a visiting writer, and then I moved to New York City. And that initiated quite a good writing period for me. New York is a strange and wonderful place, and the human carnival is always in full swing there. And so I'm going to read some New York poems tonight from both books. And this next poem is called Coney Island. Strange tubas in my ears, and the fat yellow light lulling across the boardwalk doesn't exactly help. And of course, elephants lumbering through one's thoughts, remembering where they must go to die, is not the pleasantest of situations either. And the ocean, what can you say about it? It hardly knows itself. But there it is, the one and the many waves, all doing whatever waves do, lapping doggedly at the shore, making a splash, lending themselves unwisely to human metaphor. The whole earth, meanwhile, spinning through space like a basketball on the tip of an idle god's finger. People stroll by eating hot dogs, heroes, corn on the cob, wildly purple bursts of cotton candy, and other members of the colorful, hard-to-believe food groups. Well, some of us do a pretty decent job of amusing ourselves here where the land meets the sea and music empties the air of silence. This is what we crawled up out of 400 million years ago. And this is what we've become now that we've dried ourselves off. Creatures so fearful of death will actually get on a roller coaster just to calm ourselves down. This is the much-needed transfusion of the outer to the inner world. Elephants, tubas, fat light falling across the bathers asleep on the shore of the Atlantic Ocean. Their children splashing each other in the freezing water. And now I'm going to read another poem that's set in New York, and a poem that I wrote during a particularly hot summer, hot and humid summers, which can be dreadful in the city if you're not rich enough to go to your summer house, which I wasn't. And the only thing that I should mention before I start is that the poem refers to a theory about why our distant ancestors first walked upright. And that one theory is that was to get the sun off our backs. That is, if you're on all fours, you're presenting a much bigger surface area to the sun, and so it's cooler to walk upright. I mean, cooler temperature-wise, and maybe cooler, cooler looking also. But anyway, that particular moment in our evolutionary history is one that kind of fascinates me. So there's a reference to that in here, but it's really kind of a love poem. And it's called Signs and Wonders. I'm not entirely in favor of summer, what with its drop-dead heat, its shallow, unbothered air of fullness beyond ending or enduring. Sure, I like to see half the world disappear behind this velvet green pulled from the magician's hat of the month of May, just like everybody else. And I'm aware of the sun's unbearable importance, because why would we have ever stood upright if not to get the sun off our backs when we dropped from the trees onto the burning savannas 5 million years ago? Now we can scan the horizon, carry things in our hands, give and take things to and from one another, from which all history follows. Still, I wonder whether swinging wordlessly from branch to branch might be better. I don't feel all that thankful towards the sun for bringing us here, or staging this big production, this overwritten text in which every meaning contains its opposite, the furious tenacity of life calling forth the severing response of death, etc. Just last night I was walking home thinking, is my lover going to leave me? When a dead bird plummeted from the sky, slammed onto a car hood, and rolled onto the sidewalk beside me. I'm as unhomeric as the next person, but Jesus, I said, this cannot be a good sign. Did it have a heart attack mid-flight? Or was it dropped from the talons of a predator? Or knocked out of the sky by an airplane? Or thrown down by the God assigned to watch over and comment on my various questions and predicaments? If we'd stayed in the cool shade of the forest, no birds would ever fall on us. Or if they did, we wouldn't kill ourselves trying to decipher what they might foretell. And this morning, coming up the 34th Street subway, I passed a young Russian man handing out pamphlets saying, Jesus is alive, Jesus loves you. I don't think so, but I don't know anything, only that it's hot and we don't belong here and our hands betray us and you're gone. Oh, it gets worse than that. So I'll read a few more, I'll read a couple more from this book. This next poem is called At the Poetry Reading. If we're honest with ourselves, we must admit that not every poetry reading is completely amazing and transcendent and wonderful. They can sometimes be dull and a little pretentious. I see people nodding their heads. And kind of mind-wandering inducing experiences. And so this is about that kind of a reading where your mind starts to wander places where it really should not go. And it's called At the Poetry Reading. I can't keep my eyes off the poet's wife's legs. They're so much more beautiful than anything he might be saying, though I'm no longer in a position really to judge, having stopped listening some time ago. He's from the Iowa Writers' Workshop and can therefore get along fine without my attention. He started in reading poems about his childhood, barns, corn snakes, grade school, flowers, that sort of stuff. The loss of innocence he keeps talking about between poems, which I can relate to, especially under these circumstances. Now he's on to science, a poem about hydrogen, I think. He's trying to imagine himself turning into hydrogen. Maybe he'll succeed. I'm imagining myself sliding up his wife's fluid, rhythmic, lusciously curved, black-stockinged legs, imagining them arched around my shoulders, wrapped around my back. My God, why doesn't he write poems about her? He will, no doubt, once she leaves him. Leaves him for another poet, perhaps. The observant, uninnocent one who knows a poem when it sits down in a room with him. Oh, thanks. Thank you. I often wonder if the poet in question has encountered this poem. It's been anthologized a couple times, but I haven't heard from him, so... Or his wife, no. Yeah, I would welcome that. That's why I wrote the poem. I was hoping she would see it and realize the horrible mistake she had made. But no such luck. So the next poem is another poem about poetry. And I, unfortunately, unlike many people in this audience, am not very prolific. I'm not a very prolific writer. And so this is kind of an attempt to take advantage of that and make something out of nothing. It's called The Poems I Have Not Written. I'm so wildly unprolific, the poems I have not written would reach from here to the California coast if you laid them end to end. And if you stacked them up, the poems I have not written would sway like a silent tower of Babel, saying nothing and everything in 1,000 different tongues. So moving, so filled with and emptied of suffering, so steeped in the music of a voice speechless before the truth, the poems I have not written would break the hearts of every woman who's ever left me, make them eye their husbands with a sharp contempt, and hate themselves for turning their backs on the very source of beauty. The poems I have not written would compel all other poets to ask of God, why do you let me live? I am worthless. Please strike me dead at once, destroy my works, and cleanse the earth of all my ghastly imperfections. Trees would bow their heads before the poems I have not written. Take me, they would say, and turn me into your pages, so that I might live forever as the ground from which your words arise. The wind itself, about which I might have written so eloquently, praising its slick and intersecting rivers of air, its stately calms and furious interrogations, its flute-like lingerings and passionate reproofs, would divert its course to sweep down and then pass over the poems I have not written, and the life I have not lived, the life I've failed even to imagine, which they so perfectly describe. I'm going to publish a book of the poems I have not written. It'll be much better than these books. Let's see. Yes, I guess I'll read some poems from. I'll read one more short poem. Actually, Cal, my friend Cal is here. He requested a poem from this book that I don't typically read. Because it's not one of my favorites, but Cal has given my book to like 50 people. He accounts for like 90% of my yearly book sales. So I feel like this is the least I can do to repay him. And it's just kind of an auditory snapshot of Lower Manhattan. The noise in the city. It's called Soundcheck, Lower Manhattan. Just a jumble of songs and jackhammers and roaring garbage trucks, people talking or shouting, a bitterly thin old man lying L-shaped against a building in Soho saying, "What am I going to do?" over and over, swept under in the city's onrushing waves of noise, its piercing sirens and superfluous car alarms, and subways gurgling underground. The low, invisible hum of the buildings themselves, as if breathing, their great, tired bodies standing all these years wishing to lie down and rest, and the quiet intensity of people saying nothing, turning in on themselves, the soft click of their eyes in passing, the undercurrent of their thought moving like a wind through the sidewalks thronging with life, and the sound of life, and the silence that is death waiting behind it all, saying, "Have your noise, yes, make as much as you can." And now the bright yellow brass of car horns clashing in the air above Broadway, the street itself impatient, running like a black stream down to the harbor, into the East River, buses heaving and lurching like elephants dragged from another world and made to work here where no one can sit still, where music spills from opening doors and floats like trash into the sky, where a man can ask his one question forever and never hear an answer. I would love to have someone sit there, if somebody wants to sit there. Ah, Martha. Hi. One of my students. So now I'm going to read a few poems from my most recent book, which is called Help is on the Way, which came out in 2012. And the first poem I'm going to read, excuse me, is called Valid Photo Identification Required. And it's a poem that is set in the Brooklyn DMV and the Brooklyn Social Security Office. So it's not a happy poem. Valid photo identification required. I don't understand myself, nor do I know myself, nor can I explain or prove who I am to anyone else. All I know is that I'm a man who let his out-of-state driver's license expire and who does not have his original Social Security card issued at birth or a copy of said document, to obtain which one must have an unexpired driver's license, which requires, of course, a valid Social Security card. I needed something to get me on a plane at LaGuardia. I did have a birth certificate, and when I slid it tentatively under the bulletproof plexiglass window at the Brooklyn Social Security office and said, "What about this?" to the unexpectedly sympathetic and ontologically sophisticated young Asian American man scanning my application for a replacement card, he looked at me and said, "This doesn't help. This just proves you were born. We need proof of your continued existence." I threw up my hands and looked down at my body as if to say, well, I'm standing here, aren't I? I admit I have not done much with this life. I have failed at love, let down my friends, ignored my best instincts, and given my worst ones free play. But for better or worse, I have continued to exist. Because if I hadn't continued to exist, I wouldn't be contemplating all the joys and deep satisfactions of non-existence as I am right now. I don't imagine the dead are required to show papers at every river crossing, or that only those with valid photo ID are allowed into the cauldron or the harpsichord concert, as the case may be. Often I wake at 3 a.m., I wanted to tell him, with the night terrors, scrambled fears of death, which would be one of the privileges conferred exclusively upon the living. And often I wish I could forget myself completely, forget the fragile, worried, rabbit-hearted self that seems to run my life, forget the whole nightmarish mess. I wouldn't have that feeling if I hadn't continued to exist, would I? It's true, I wanted to confess, I have no children to mirror me into the future, and mostly I only half inhabit the poems I've written, a ghostly, uneasy absence floating just below the lines. In fact, from the Buddhist perspective, I don't exist, but neither do you, nor any of this. A luminous emptiness is all there is. Instead, I tell him I just want to visit my parents for Christmas in Nebraska, for Christ's sakes, which was no help. Yeah, I'm realizing more and more that my poems seem to spring from things going wrong, things going badly awry. That is the star that I have hitched my poetic wagon to, unfortunately. And this is this is just a poem of sort of irritation, I guess. So this is another poem about the noise in New York City. It's called "Getting Where We're Going." And, one of the things you notice about New York is just the loudness of the place. I mean, that's one of the things that can just drive you mad there. And much of the noise, of course, comes from car horns, people just, blaring their car horns. And the car horn is clearly the most important part of the car for New Yorkers. And when a New Yorker goes to buy a car, that's the first question they ask is, how loud is the horn? And how abrasive is it? And does the warranty cover horn replacement? If I should wear out the horn, like in 6 months or a year, can I get it replaced? So anyway, this is a poem written in response to all that noise. It's called Getting Where We're Going. Surfeit of distance and the racked mind waiting, nipping at itself, snarling inwardly at strangers. If I had a car in this town, I'd rig it up with a rear bumper horn, something to blast back at the jackasses who honk the second the light turns green. If you could gather up all the horn honks of just one day in New York City, tie them together in a big brassy knot high above the city, and honk them all at once, it would shiver the skyscrapers to nothingness, as if they were made of sand, and usher in the second coming. Christ would descend from the sky, wincing with his fingers in his ears, and judge us all insane. Who'd want people like us up there yelling at each other, trashing the cloudy, angelic streets with our candy wrappers and newspapers and coffee cups? Besides, we'd still be waiting for the next thing to happen in heaven, the next violin concerto or cotton candy festival or breathtaking vista to open beneath our feet, and thinking this place isn't quite what it's cracked up to be, and why in hell does everybody want to get here? We'd still be waiting for someone else to come and make us happy, staring through whatever's in front of us, cursing the light that never seems to change. And cars are a source of annoyance in New York, and the subway offers a whole realm of frustration and irritation. And the subways are wonderful in New York, and in many ways, but occasionally they break down in ways that are just incredibly frustrating. So sometimes you'll be on a train, everything is going fine, and suddenly the conductor will come on the intercom and announce that the next station will be the last stop on the train, and that the train is now taken out of service, or it's going to go backwards, or the train's on fire, or something like that. And then you're given incredibly garbled and complicated and often contradictory instructions on how to find an alternate route to get where you're going. And if you're a New Yorker, you can almost figure it out. But for people who don't live there, it's the panic on their faces is terrifying. So anyway, this is a poem about that kind of experience, and it's spoken entirely in the voice of the subway conductor. It's called Change in Service. Attention passengers, there is no uptown local service on the one train at this time. Repeat, there is no uptown local service on the one train at this time. For uptown local service, transfer at 14th Street across the platform to the downtown number 2 train. Take the downtown number 2 train to Chambers Street. At Chambers Street, transfer to shuttle bus service for South Street Ferry. At South Street Ferry, take a Circle Line sightseeing cruise ship up the East River to the 59th Street Bridge. At the 59th Street Bridge, fling yourself overboard and swim to Roosevelt Island. From Roosevelt Island, take the tramway back to Manhattan. Exit the tramway and take a cab to the FDR Expressway. Proceed north on the FDR Expressway to the George Washington Bridge. Cross the George Washington Bridge and take the Palisades Parkway north to Piermont. At Piermont, rent a kayak and paddle down the Hudson River to 96th and Riverside. From 96th and Riverside, walk east to Central Park West, turn right on Central Park West, and proceed south to Columbus Circle. At Columbus Circle, take a rickshaw to 42nd Street Times Square. At 42nd Street Times Square, ride the escalator down past the Fellini-esque organist with the swiveling, trumpet-playing monkey dolls, and board the uptown local 1 train, which is now running on the downtown number 2 express track across the platform. Return to 14th Street and begin again. Have a nice day, and thank you for writing the MTA. Some of that was an exaggeration. But actually the first 15 lines or so are pretty much verbatim. Okay, here's a poem about things going wrong. It's called Dear Internal Revenue Service. and and this is an epistolary poem, so it's in the form of a letter to the IRS. And just a couple things. I wrote it in 2005, but it refers to the time when I lived in the Pacific Northwest, which I mentioned in the first poem, and left there. And then it also, I teach now, but when I was in New York, I did not teach. I didn't teach for like 12 years. So there's a point in the poem where it says I don't teach. So just to clarify, because I do teach now. Anyway. Okay. Dear Internal Revenue Service, thank you for your letter informing me of the errors in my 2005 filing. I'm enclosing a check for $5,657 to cover the tax which I evidently still owe and the interest on that tax. I would hereby like to ask, however, that you forgive the penalty of $1,136 since the employer failed to send me a 1099 for the income I made as a consultant that year. Of course, I realize it's my responsibility to report all my income, but in the absence of a 1099, I simply forgot. I have a number of clients, and I'm obviously not the best bookkeeper. Nor am I particularly good with money. I am a poet as well as a freelance writer, and being a poet isn't quite as lucrative as you might imagine. You may notice, for example, that for all of last year, I received $57 in royalties. A friend of mine helpfully observed that I could have made more money as a parking meter, to which I replied that I could have made a lot more money as a parking meter and gotten a lot more respect as well. Unlike most hard-working poets in America, I don't teach, mainly because I don't know anything. I'm probably not all that far from the cliched notion of the romantic poet you yourself may hold. I get stoned sometimes and stare at trees and clouds for hours on end, try to see the wind, etc. I weep for no reason, remember real or imagined slights for ages, and lick my wounds with words. I live in a studio apartment, a garret, if you will. I have a huge desk. It's like the deck of a ship, and I, its landlocked captain, gazing out to sea. It sits underneath my sleeping loft, which my girlfriend likes to call the lofty loft, for reasons I won't go into here, as they may seem inappropriate, or too personal, or perhaps irrelevant to my purpose, which is to ask for your forgiveness of the penalty and to offer reasons why by explaining the hardships of the poet's life. I'll just say that sometimes it gets pretty lofty up there, and sometimes we imagine we're on a magic carpet drifting smoothly above the city below in its state of semi-controlled slow motion collapse, and on out over the ocean, which she loves and fears just like I do, or over the summer campy Catskills where we can't afford to buy a country house, with their worn-down mountains and charmingly self-effacing trees, so unlike the impossibly massive and overly serious cedars and hemlocks and Douglas fir trees of the Pacific Northwest, where I used to live until poverty forced me east. Those trees are brooders, dignified, mist-shrouded monsters, beautiful, of course, and awe-inspiring. I wonder if you have felt this, but too damply archaic and imposing and uncomprehendable for my taste. I like a tree you can take in with a single steady gaze. I wonder if you are as bad at poetry as I am at accounting. Perhaps we are the inverted mirror images of each other. I don't imagine you get asked that question very often, or receive many letters like this one. Maybe you're reading this out loud, even now, to your office. I almost said cellmates. Of my book, a reviewer once said that you simply can't resist reading many of these poems out loud to someone else. And I wonder if you feel this, the irresistible need to read this poem aloud. I'm sure the letters you receive are mostly angry ones, the kind that say things like, "Here, take my goddamn money, and buy Dick Cheney a few more gallons of puppy blood for his nightly ablutions." Or, "Dear IRS, please use the enclosed check to purchase some handheld rocket launchers to blast the fuck out of some poor Iraqi's house, which you prefer to call a suspected insurgent stronghold." Or, "Please give this money to the CEO of Exxon so he can buy silk socks while I regurgitate my supper and try not to starve." I thought of taking that approach. I felt that desire to get in a shot or two, to give voice to righteous indignation, treat you like a non-person, someone mindlessly and heartlessly saying no all day long. But I'm done with all that. I want to reach you, to speak to you as a fellow human being, immersed in the same joys and suffering as I am. Didn't you once write poems yourself? Poems of anguish and loss and loneliness? And to remind you of the karmic delights of forgiveness that await you if you release me from this debt. I did actually send a letter to the IRS that wasn't quite that long, but it was, it had some of the same language and the same lines in it, and you may not be surprised to learn that I did not receive an answer. Okay. Wow, time has flown by, at least for me. So I'll just read a couple more poems from this book. These are short poems. This is a poem called "So Long," as in see you later. So long. To break this day free from all the others, to stand at the morning end of it and push off from the shore, sail beyond the reach of all my failures calling after me. You can't just leave us here. Shaking their fists, crowding into the water, clamoring, "We made you who you are." To feel their voices growing small underneath the surf, the wide, unknowable ocean all before me. It's fantastically hot in here, isn't it? Yeah. Can anything be done about that? Why did I wait so long to ask, I guess? So I'm just going to read a couple more poems from this book and then a couple new poems, and then we'll do a little Q&A. So this is a very short poem, very simple poem. It's just a little dialogue poem that consists only of conversation, and it's called "On the Subway Platform" for Kate. "Where are you going?" I said. And she said, "I'm going to look for a book." And I said, "What kind of book?" "A book on perfectionism," she said. And I said, "Make sure you get the right one." Which brought forth such perfect laughter from her perfect heart. Okay, so I'll read a couple new poems. The poem I'm going to read, New Yorker cruising by. Oh, it's a train. Okay, sorry. No, it's the conductor of the train is from New York. This is the poem that was on the broadside. Thank you. It's called "Back Then." Some of you have heard it before. Some of you have heard it a number of times before, and now you're going to hear it again. I suffer from what might be described as nostalgic personality disorder. Everybody's a wise guy. And so, yeah, I spent a lot of time missing places and people and wishing things were the way they used to be back then. Everything was better back then. Even my nostalgia was better, more piercing, more true. I miss missing things that much, but it's not as much as I missed missing things back then. Even my anxieties about the future, which have indeed come to pass, were more vivid back then, more real. Reality itself seemed more real back then. This clanking stage play only a fool could find convincing. I fell for it all, and it killed me again and again. Ghosts of myself wander the cities I've lived in, thinking of other cities, imagining me here, imagining them. We nod to each other across the years, the way the last line of a poem will sometimes look back wistfully at the first. All right, just a couple more. Okay, this is the one that appeared in The Sun, and it's also a very short poem that's just a dialogue poem. It's pretty much a verbatim conversation. It's called No Day at the Beach. It's no day at the beach being me, I said. It's no walk in the park. I can see that, she said. Trust me, I said. It's no picnic. Clearly, she said. What's that supposed to mean, I said. I'm just agreeing with you, she said. You might have argued a bit, I said. Tried to convince me otherwise. Who knows, maybe it is a day at the beach being me. Or maybe it's a day at the beach being with me. No, she said, it's not. Okay. What time am I supposed to stop? 5 of? 10 of?
Yeah, read a couple more.
Just a couple more, okay. All right. Well, I'll read one more and maybe two more. This is a relatively new poem that I've only read once in public before, and I survived that experience. So I'm going to try it again and hope for the best. It's called Past Lives of the Poets. I went to a psychic yesterday, paid $90 for 45 minutes of otherworldly advice. Mostly it was standard issue, new age mumbo jumbo. You need to let yourself receive the love you desire. Surrender. Do you know about surrender? I keep a white flag in my hip pocket, I wanted to say, but merely nodded, surrendering to the onslaught of platitudes. But when she laid me down and started with the witchy incantations, I felt the words falling into me like drops of ink into a calm, clear pond. It seems almost like someone has placed a curse on you, she said. That would explain a few things, I thought. Let's see if we can remove it. And I could feel her rummaging the ether for the right pair of metaphysical pliers. I'm sensing that in a past life you were an artist, a painter, like in Italy during the Renaissance, and someone, a rival artist, set out to destroy you. That scenario felt perfectly plausible as well. Those Renaissance artists didn't fuck around. Fra Lippo Lippi sent a gang of Florentine thugs to the Tuscan countryside to kill a rival painter, Jacopo di Poggiobanzi, for appropriating figures from Lippi's adoration. Was I a murdered Italian painter in a past life? Is that why I fantasize about shortening the careers of certain other poets in this one? Sometimes at poetry readings, I'm thankful I don't own a gun. If a pretentious poet whose wildly overrated work you hated had come to town to promote his 27th book, and you were sitting in the audience holding your head in your hands, dreaming of blissful, endless, unself-referential silence, and you did have a gun in your backpack or shoulder holster, wouldn't it be exhilarating to stand up and shout, I am going to shoot you because your poems are terrible and you don't realize it? And then to feel your arm kick back as the poet crashes unmetaphorically to the floor, and the audience is aghast but wondering if this is some kind of postmodernist melodrama or Dadaist revival meeting, while you slip away into the mystical moist night air and the poetry gods smile down on you, their agent and minister, in gratitude. Imagine the headlines: poet shot by enraged rival during reading. I would want to read such an article, and so would everyone else, and for once you would have the world's undivided attention, and soon some senator from Texas or Arizona would introduce legislation not only allowing but requiring all poets to carry handguns at readings, and poetry would once again become the dangerous art it was always meant to be. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks. Yeah. So I think I'll end there, and we can and take some questions for a few minutes. Yes.
Did they forgive the penalty?
The IRS? No, they did not. They did not. They did not respond to my letter. I thought it might cheer up some humble servant. But no, they did not. They didn't. Yeah. And I entered that poem in a prize, the Rattle Magazine prize, that has a $5,000 prize money, and it came in second. So it would have been perfect. It would have wiped out it would have just been like, yeah, I know, justice, right? Doesn't happen. Yeah. Yeah. Influenced the poets who have most influenced me, or most recently, or
Yes, generally speaking, and most recently.
yeah. Well, let's see. I mean, there's a lot. Frank O'Hara is a big influence for me. James Schuyler, the New York School poets have been really important for me. I love their work. But a lot of people: Frost, Bishop, Whitman. Yeah, lots of people. Those are the ones. Philip Larkin. Yeah. Neruda. Yeah. Ron Padgett recently. I love his work. Yeah. Yeah.
When did you start writing?
When did I start? I started in high school. I had an English teacher who was amazing. She just let us write for the whole period. I don't remember her really even saying much to us, but you could just daydream and get stoned and then come to class and write poems, and I thought, this is awesome. So yeah. So it was in high school, and then in college I was very fortunate. To the first poetry class I took, the teacher was wonderful, and he liked my poems a lot. He praised my poems, which you know how that is. But in high school and then in college. But I come from a working class family, so nobody in my family was encouraging me to write poetry. That's like the last thing that they would ever think, like, oh yeah, our son's a poet. Isn't that great? But that turned out to be kind of a good thing for me, actually.
Were you living in Nebraska?
Yeah, I was living in Nebraska then. Yeah, where you don't go around announcing to the world that you're a poet. I mean, maybe now you do, but yeah.
Do you regret not becoming a car mechanic?
I did that day, absolutely. Yeah, I was just, my dad could fix anything, and I didn't pay attention to a word of what he said, when I was working on cars, to his great disappointment. Yeah, he would have been much more happy if I had become a car mechanic. But yeah.
So you seem to draw inspiration on your misery.
Yeah. Oh, you got that, huh?
What other areas do you draw inspiration?
Well, what else is there? Well, let me think about that. Well, I mean, sometimes it's just conversations, like things that people say will spark a poem, New York City was tremendously inspiring. I mean, you just walk down the street with your eyes open, and you see things to write about that spark the imagination. So it's hard to generalize, but it does. Things going badly wrong is definitely a major source of inspiration, and it's kind of it's hard, because you don't wish that on yourself, of course, but that does seem to be where the poems come from most. So, yeah.
You say you teach now?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, you teach poetry?
Yeah.
And where?
Oh, yeah. I teach at Mountain Writers Workshop and at Literary Arts. Yeah, and I'm actually teaching a course on Frank O'Hara and James Schuyler that's starting March 11th. Yeah.
But you said in the letter to the IRS that you don't know anything.
Well, that's true. That's true. Thanks for bringing that up at this moment, Ken. Appreciate that. Yeah. People might have forgotten that by now if you hadn't. But yeah, right. But that was a long time ago. That was 2005, and I've learned a lot since then. So, yeah.
Part of me is back in Utah, wondering how the hell you got out of that situation.
Oh yeah. Well, I turned out I was in Wyoming, and I drove the car to the nearest town, just like billowing smoke. And the mechanic said there was a hole in the oil can. Is that not the oil can? What is it called? The oil pan. Yeah. You see how much I know. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And he said, we can order this, but it'll take like 3 days to get here because it was like on a Saturday or something. He said, or you can drive it the rest of the way to Lincoln, Nebraska, which was another, I don't know, like 500 miles or so, and just stop like every 50 or 100 miles and put in like a quart of oil. So that's what I did. I bought a case of oil, and then I stopped, and put oil in and kept driving. And so, yeah, I got there, but it wasn't easy, and then I got it fixed, yeah. These are such literary questions you're asking. Oh, it's kind of complicated. I left New York just because the city was kind of driving me crazy, and I went to Boulder, Colorado, partly to be closer to my parents who were elderly. And then I developed this heart condition, atrial fibrillation, which is much more challenging at 5,000 feet altitude. So I wanted to get back to sea level, and Portland seemed like the best option because I knew people here, and it's a great city, and so I'm glad to be here. Yeah.
Are you inspired by, you talked about, and I know this about New York, that
Yeah.
It's a visually rich,
Yeah.
auditorily rich
Right.
place.
Yeah.
What inspires you here locally now?
Well, not so much. I want to have a more connected sort of creative relationship with the city itself. And I think in New York, you don't have to seek that out. And in Portland, I kind of feel like you do. Although, Matthew Dickman is a great poet who writes about the city of Portland in a way that feels somewhat like the way I write about New York. So it can be done. But, it's just kind of whatever happens in my life, So it's not so much the city as a place. The thing about New York is, everyone recognizes, you say Broadway, and everybody knows what you're talking about, the Brooklyn Bridge. It's all these cultural icons that you can refer to that are part of everybody's kind of shared cultural awareness. So it's a different, situation. So that's not a very good answer to your question. Sorry. It's challenging, yeah. Yeah, so, uh-oh.
Huge fan of your work, and
Thank you.
you're obviously a great teacher, great speaker, great poet, but you also seem like someone who's like a physical person too.
Uh-huh.
And so I just wondered who your high school football coach.
I am so glad you asked that question. My high school football coach was Frank Solich, and he was the head coach of the University of Nebraska Cornhuskers until he was erroneously and unceremoniously fired. But yeah, he was my football coach. Yeah.
Did he influence your work as a poet at all?
Well, I haven't explored that aspect of influence. But being a football player, sure, yeah, I loved it. I was a defensive end, if you can believe that. Yeah, it was fun.
Well, John
Yeah.
John is going to be here Hello, do we have one last question?
There was a hand back there. Yeah.
Back here, okay.
Well, what I wanted to say was I find you very witty,
Oh.
kind of like Billy Collins, in your writing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thanks. Thanks. Billy Collins gets $20,000 for a poetry reading. So I'm not. I think there's a donation thing back there. Yeah. Well, hey, she made the comparison.
So we have coffee and tea, refreshments over here. John's going to be here. There are books over here, books of John's, for purchase
Yeah.
and autographing.
Yeah.
Let's give him another hand.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.